Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Museum and the second day of the Viet Nam and the Presidency Conference, the first conference to be jointly sponsored by all the presidential libraries and the National Archives. For scholars and students, presidential libraries hold the memory of our nation. They are unique repositories of our country's history. And for the general public, their interactive museums offer visitors the opportunity to hear, see, and experience the events that shaped our nation and understand the lessons of leadership. We're especially honored here at the Kennedy Library to host this conference, and on behalf of the library, the foundation, and the members of my family, I want to thank all of you for coming. President Kennedy wrote that history was the means by which a nation establishes its sense of identity and purpose. In his book, Profiles in Courage, the 50th anniversary of which we celebrate this year, he also proved that the lessons of history can be used not only to illuminate the past, but to set the standards by which we measure our leaders. He encouraged members of his cabinet to read The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's history of the misjudgments that led to the First World War, in order that American leaders would never be in the same position as German leaders after the war. When the foreign minister was asked after the war was over and 20 million lives had been lost, how did it all happen? He answered, if only we knew. This conference and the continuing popular dialogue about the war in Vietnam help to play a critical role in making sure that Americans will know and understand the causes and consequences of this conflict. The span of that history is long. Outside in the foyer, there are documents from Presidential Library archives chronicling U.S. involvement in Vietnam, beginning with notes from a 1943 discussion in Tehran between President Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin on the fate of Indochina, and culminating with the decision to normalize relations between the United States and Vietnam, symbolized by the first official visit to Hanoi in November 2000 by President Bill Clinton. Yet the lessons of Vietnam have never been more relevant. Those of us who grew up in families and in a society torn apart by Vietnam and who are parents today struggle to help our own children make sense of another controversial foreign war that is coming into our homes and changing our world. That's why we are so especially grateful to the policymakers, officials, reporters, war veterans, and historians who are willing to share their wisdom and experience with us today. I know how much my father relied on the advice and counsel of Ted Sorensen, and we're so fortunate to have him here, along with so many other extraordinary participants and observers of our country's longest conflict. I know I speak on behalf of everyone in the audience in expressing my appreciation to all the speakers for your willingness to participate in these historic proceedings. I also want to thank the Archivist of the United States, Alan Weinstein, and the National Archives and Records Administration, under whose auspices this conference has been sponsored, and all the presidential libraries and library foundations for their support. We're especially grateful to President Jimmy Carter, who, though he could not be here today, offered an exclusive interview on how the war in Vietnam affected his presidency, and to President Gerald Ford, who personally invited members of his administration to ensure that this conference would have the richest possible participation of policymakers from the Kennedy through Reagan presidencies. Finally, I want to thank Deborah Leff, the director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, and all those at the Kennedy Library and Foundation who worked to organize this event. Moderating today's sessions is someone who began following the war and commenting on it to the president as a 7.5-year-old boy. I have a copy of a letter he wrote. It's a little flag here. Look at this. On November 25th, 1966, the original of which is on display at the Johnson Library in Texas. Dear Mr. President, I hope that the men in Vietnam are doing well. How are you feeling? I hope you are feeling good. I am 7.5 years old, and I like you. Now, I have not been to the White House before, but I will sometime. I live in New York State in Elmira. I want to visit you. Signed, one of your young Democrats, Brian Williams. Even though every sentence ends with an exclamation point, I guess he never got that invitation because today Brian Williams is a registered independent. In the introductory essay to the book, Dear Mr. President, in which this letter is reprinted, Brian Williams explains that as a child he was not allowed to eat dinner until after the evening news. So the story of the Vietnam War unfolded nightly in his family's den, as it did in so many other American homes, and he can tie events in his family's history to milestones in the war. It was during these hungry years that young Brian hatched his dream to be a TV news anchorman, a childhood fantasy that came true in December 2004 when he was named anchor of the NBC Nightly News. Since that time, he has become the nation's most watched news anchor and distinguished himself most recently with his coverage from New Orleans of the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina, which has been widely compared to the work of Edward R. Murrow. Brian Williams understands the presidency, having served as NBC's chief White House correspondent during the Clinton's first term in office, and he's continued to cover U.S. foreign policy and the war on terror. He spent days in the desert south of Najaf with the Army's 3rd Infantry Division and was one of the first correspondents to reach Baghdad after the invasion began. As anchor, he has continued to produce riveting reports on how American soldiers wounded on the front lines in Iraq and Afghanistan are overcoming their injuries at Walter Reed Hospital. We are honored to have him with us here today to guide our discussions and hope that his participation will encourage more Americans to take a greater interest in America's past and in the events of our own time. Thank you.
Well, Caroline, I don't quite know how to thank you for that. No document ever disappears with this library crowd. I forgot that they could find that. So I was 7. If you look closely at the letter, which I'm sure Caroline is having distributed to all members of the audience today as part of your packet, I spelled it Democrat, C-R-E-T. So technically, I was making no reference to any known party. And as she correctly pointed out, since I have come of age to vote, I've been a registered independent, as in my view, every good journalist should ever since. I'm thrilled to be here in this city where my father was born, in this museum dedicated to a man I worshipped in life and in death. And I want to thank the organizers, the volunteers, all the participants, obviously, all the members of the audience. We have 1,000 people watching over at the Satellite Center at UMass, and hundreds of thousands will see this thanks to the good folks at C-SPAN. And a tip of the hat, of course, to the presidential libraries, who are doing this as a collective, as a consortium, and we appreciate that. I'm proud to say I've visited most of the presidential libraries in this country. All of this is happening under the aegis of the Archivist of the United States. And we should pause to remember that over the door at the National Archives, as many of you already well know, it says, "Past is prologue." And we should really make that our motto and our operating thesis, in my view, here today. America has a wound. We have many wounds, of course. We ask the Native American community in this nation. We have wounds like Antietam and Selma and Dallas and Ground Zero. These days, I would add to the list a place I always considered the most interesting city in the country, New Orleans, Louisiana. But there's no wound as raw and as wide and shared by so many American families in our day and generation as the Vietnam War. And today we're going to talk about it, and we're going to deconstruct it, and we're going to debate it, and we're going to ask and answer questions about it. That's where you come in. You all have cards, and we will bring your questions up here, and we will try to mix it up as best we can. So that is an important role of what you're going to see unfold. We will hear from men and women who know war, who have written about it, who have witnessed it, who've talked about it, and who've fought. By my count, there are 7 veterans on today's panels. Back to past is prologue for just a moment. Vietnam affected 9 presidents. It led to the outright defeat, that is to say, departure from office of one of them, and arguably a promise to end the Vietnam War guaranteed the re-election of another. Some would argue and have that we are fighting in many ways the same war today. Something tells me that argument will come up today. Vietnam is a constant in the life of each of the post-Vietnam era American presidents. I recently talked to one of them, and this is how we'll start the morning, with a former president who happens to be a veteran of the U.S. Navy. Ladies and gentlemen, my conversation recently with President Jimmy Carter. Mr. President, first of all, on behalf of the library, thank you for doing this, and I think we should start fairly generally. That is, the effect on your life, on your presidency as a veteran, as a father, the effect of the Vietnam War.
Well, first of all, I had a son, my oldest son, Jack, who was in Vietnam. He was at Georgia Tech as a student, felt that the draft or absence of it wasn't fair, so he left the college and went to Vietnam. And obviously, I inherited the White House from Gerald Ford, under whom the withdrawal from Vietnam took place. So it was a very important issue in my own life personally. Within the next year or so, we began talks with the Vietnamese representatives at the United Nations and in Washington to see if we could normalize relations with them. That didn't pan out while I was president, but I've been very grateful that it did occur not too long after that.
How serious, Mr. President, did those talks on normalization ever get?
Well, they obviously reached my point as President of the United States. I had memoranda from the Secretary of State, from the National Security Advisor, pro and con, recommending the degree of publicity that we could give to the secret talks, how many of the members of Congress we should involve. The first demands of the Vietnam people was that we, representatives, were that we pay reparations to them in some way, and they finally, in 1978, I believe it was, dropped that demand. It was complicated to some degree by the fact that during the same year, 1978, was when I was involved in intense and personal negotiations to normalize diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. So compared to China and compared to the Camp David talks between Israel and Egypt, I would have to say that the Vietnam normalization was not the top priority on my list.
And looking back in the long view of history, it would have been awfully early compared to the date of withdrawal from Vietnam to have normalized relationships, I guess, during your administration.
Well, it would have been quite early, but we did begin talks, I know, I've looked up some of the records recently, in 1978. So it was a matter of discussion then, but as I say, it wasn't the top priority.
You have called the pardon the most difficult decision you had to make during your campaign for president. It was clearly your first official act as president. Go back, if you will, and remember for us the thinking that went into the pardon.
Yes, well, in the inaugural ceremonies on the stage with President Gerald Ford, one of my closest and best personal friends now, I departed from my original text to thank him for having healed our nation, a man whom I had just defeated in the 1976 campaign. And when I left the inaugural stage, a platform, and went inside the Capitol building, before I even went to the White House, I signed a directive that gave a pardon to all those who had defected from our military in order to avoid service in Vietnam. I didn't pardon deserters from the military, but those who did defect and went to Canada, I gave a blanket pardon to them. It was a very difficult political issue. And I know that within that same brief period of time, I spoke to the American Legion, I believe it was, and my action in giving the pardon was not the most popular thing in that big forum. But it was the right thing to do, and I was just following up basically on the heroic action that President Gerald Ford had taken in trying to heal our nation and to give us a chance to move beyond the Vietnam War and the obsession with Vietnam into another era of life.
Of course, before the ink was dry, and you referenced this, the critics said it went too far, that it dropped ongoing prosecutions. The critics on the other side said, well, you didn't allow for deserters. What is it? Was it the first lesson in your presidency of not being able to please anyone and no good deed going unpunished?
Well, it had to be the first lesson in my presidency because the first thing I ever did in my presidency.
That's right.
Other than give my inaugural address. It was done within 30 minutes after I was inaugurated president. And so it was a good indication to me, not all that surprising because I had been governor beforehand and I'd been in politics a good bit. But there's no way to please everybody, certainly on something that was as obsessive in our country as was the Vietnam War. And beginning, as you know, 10 years earlier, in 1968 with the Democratic Convention with massive demonstrations, this altercation had been a deep and penetrating division in our country. But I think that was a major step that was necessary at the time, and I don't have any regrets since then, in starting to heal our country and getting us to move beyond the Vietnam War to better things.
Mr. President, I was in an airport recently and saw a group of volunteer greeters waiting for some combat veterans to return home from Iraq, and I thought to myself, if only that had happened for our veterans in the Vietnam conflict. Some people often say, as you know, you can go ahead and hate the war if you want to, but don't hate the soldiers fighting it because their actions are noble on the battlefield, reflecting the decision of the chain of command. I'm curious as to your feelings about how returning veterans were treated in this country after the Vietnam War.
Well, as I said earlier, Brian, my oldest son was one of those who did return. I think he came home to Plains twice while he was in the military. And he was averse to wearing his uniform while he was home on leave because there was a lot of scorn and derogation and condemnation of him for being so naive as to leave the sinecure of a college education at Georgia Tech and going to Vietnam. He was condemned by his own peer group. And it was only when I became president and I appointed Max Cleland, a Vietnam veteran who, as you know, a triple amputee, to head up the Veterans Department of the government, that healing process made major strides forward. And I think eventually, of course, with the Vietnam Heroic Monument, one of the most popular places in Washington, that healing process was complete. I see a lot of similarity with the Gulf War as far as the concentration of sacrifice on just a very few people. This is unique in the history of our country that only those who are now going to Iraq for the third time and their families are the only ones that are called upon to make any sort of sacrifice as part of a war effort. And so there's a lot of difference, but one of the things that has been different in Vietnam and now is that I believe all of us do revere the unique sacrifice, almost unique, that the veterans who are coming back from Iraq are making for our country. Because a lot of them in the National Guard and the Army Reserve have to go back to Vietnam, to Iraq, over and over. So we revere them now. This was not the case in Vietnam.
Mr. President, some of the people watching and listening to this no doubt are active in the MIA movement, which was, of course, active during your presidency. Talk about your efforts where POWs, MIAs are concerned, and looking back, are you satisfied that you did enough?
I'm satisfied that I did everything I could. As you know, there were a number of Americans who erroneously believed that their loved ones who were missing in action were still alive. and were moving around somehow or another in Vietnam, either under restraint or voluntarily. And this was an exacerbating factor during the time that I was president. All the information that I had showed that these reports were non-substantive, that there weren't any appreciable number of those missing in action who were still alive in Vietnam. But they put tremendous restraint on American public opinion, on the members of Congress, and indirectly on me, in not being willing to acknowledge that the MIAs were actually permanently missing in action. We did everything we possibly could to get the Vietnamese to let us explore for those who were lost and to try to account for every single person. I think eventually almost every person who was missing in action in Vietnam were accounted for.
Was the Carter-era Pentagon, sir, should it be considered a post-war Pentagon? Was it a military machine that was recovering from a conflict just fought?
Well, the military that I inherited was minimal, and there was a major adverse reaction when I became president to any sort of emphasis on military capability. Vietnam turned our nation against a strong military. I came from a military background. That was my chosen profession. And I elevated military budgets and commitments to improved weaponry to a top level of priority in my administration. I brought in a revered scientist, Harold Brown, who had been the president of Caltech, and the top administrator who had been in charge of the Coca-Cola Company to run the Defense Department. So almost all of the weaponry that has been devised since then originated in the embryonic stages during my administration under Harold Brown's leadership. So we made a major commitment to strengthen our military and to emphasize not just on the number of ships and the number of tanks, but on the technical capabilities of new weaponry.
Your mission in the desert to rescue the hostages in Iran, to what extent were the ghosts of the Vietnam War flying along on that mission?
I really can't say that there was very much of a spillover from Vietnam to my effort to rescue the hostages. It was a well-planned operation. We had explored the so-called Desert One area with a small airplane landing there and taking soil samples. We had what we thought was an adequate number of helicopters to get all of the hostages out. We knew where every hostage was. We knew the identity of all their guards. We knew what kind of automobiles they drove to work every day. We monitored when they went and when they didn't. We knew the degree of lethargy or laxity within the compound, and so the whole plan was very good. Unfortunately, we underestimated the number of helicopters that would be lost in the rescue operation and had to withdraw in failure. But I can't really say, Brian, that the effect of Vietnam carried over into that operation.
I do recall reading at the time, and perhaps in more recent years, whether they were historians or just plain journalists, attributing the underpinnings of the failure in part to the post-Vietnam era military, where special forces weren't up to snuff, weren't what they should have been. So you're saying that would be a misreading of the circumstance?
Yeah, it would be a total misleading assessment. The special forces in all aspects of the military performed superbly. The only thing is that we set up a number of helicopters. We had to have 6 helicopters to get all of our hostages out. And to get a portion of them out and leave the rest behind would undoubtedly have doomed them to be executed. So the premise from the very beginning was, unless we have 6 helicopters, we will not go through with the operation. We thought we had enough helicopters. We had 8. 2 of them were one turned back in an unexplained way still. One was put down in a sandstorm, and another one developed a last-minute hydraulic problem with its system and had to turn back. So that was why the mission failed, as I explained to the people the next morning, that same morning. But it was not because of an inability or incompetence or lack of courage or commitment on the part of anyone.
I'm going to quote from one of your news conferences, January 17th, 1979. Vietnam came up vis-a-vis Iran. You answered a question in part, certainly we have no desire nor ability to intrude massive forces into Iran or any other country to determine the outcome of domestic political issues. This is something that we have no intention of ever doing in another country. We tried this once in Vietnam. It didn't work well, as you know. Mr. President, expand on, give us some context for the period and your meaning then.
I think that's a very prescient and accurate statement that I made. As you know, historically, the United States has adopted a policy of going to war, of invading a country, bombing a country, attacking a country, only if our security was directly threatened. The premise in Vietnam, which you'd have to argue about this one way or the other, was that we were threatened because of statements, explanations made by President Johnson and others, even Dwight Eisenhower and Kennedy, that there was a threat that communism would prevail in the entire Asian field, since both the Russian, Soviet Union, and China were helping the Vietnamese, and we saw this as a means of prevailing throughout Asia, and that's why we went to war in Vietnam, which didn't turn out to be well. At that time, the premise was, for me and all my predecessors, Democratic and Republican, was that we would resort to war only if our security was directly threatened. Now we have a different policy that President George W. Bush has promulgated. That is preemptive war. We now have a brand new, unprecedented policy of reserving the right to go to war against another country, even though our security is not directly threatened. That's a new and radical departure from all Republican and Democratic presidents in recent history.
On the topic of the current war in Iraq, Mr. President, how far are you willing to go in any comparisons or analogies to the conflict in Vietnam?
I would do this comparison cautiously because I think the Vietnam War turned out so badly for the United States with ostentatious and clear defeat, our withdrawing troops from the top of buildings and helicopters at the last minute, our opponents in Vietnam completely prevailing politically and militarily, and I would hope and pray and expect that this will not happen to us in Iraq. There are some elements of the Vietnam War that might very well be similar or pertinent, and that is unanticipated length of involvement, the unanticipated number of casualties, unanticipated cost of the war, and doubtful premises on which we went to war. So there are some similarities, but I think in the long term, I believe that we will not have to withdraw from Iraq in any sort of ostentatious or clear failure as we did in Vietnam.
And Mr. President, since this event is happening under the auspices of the JFK Presidential Library and Museum, perhaps I can get you to talk about how you view the Kennedy role in the Vietnam War. Do you see it as a Kennedy conflict that then Lyndon Johnson inherited and, as we now know, famously struggled with and escalated?
Well, there are undoubtedly scholars and political figures are participating directly at the Kennedy Center that know a lot more about that early stage of our history than do I. My understanding as a young non-politician, I was just a peanut farmer then, was that the commitment to go to Vietnam was made basically by President Kennedy. I think he intended for it to be a limited participation. It was after the French withdrew, and we thought we would fill their role in protecting Asia against communism. And then I think that President Johnson, when he inherited the presidency, got deeper and deeper involved, and it became a matter of national pride and his personal ego and his commitment to prevail, to nail a coonskin to the barn door or something of that kind. And the forces of insurgency were against us. And I think that we underestimated the tenacity of the North Vietnamese, and we also overestimated the capabilities and commitment of those who were on our side among the Vietnamese. So I would say it was greatly escalated and expanded under Lyndon Johnson, initiated by President Kennedy.
How do you view the domino theory today? As, you know, looking back, of course, now that we're looking at the Cold War in the rearview mirror, it fueled so much of the military-industrial society buildup in this country.
Well, the domino theory, I think, was a real threat, and it was probably exaggerated in retrospect as a cause for our going into Vietnam. But when I was president during the Cold War, every nation in the world, even the most tiny nations like Burkina Faso and Liberia and Mali, obviously Ethiopia and larger countries, were looked upon as a testing ground in the competition between democracy as we see it and communism espoused by the Soviet Union. So we were in competition in every nation in every region in the world. And there was always a premise that if the Soviets did prevail in a particular region of the world, if we should withdraw or be less than totally committed, then that communism might prevail on a global basis. So I think that the domino threat was real, although it was misjudged and maybe exaggerated, for instance, in the case of Vietnam.
As an event that affected the presidencies of several men, looking at Vietnam in terms of what it did to the American presidency, do you regard it as among the darker moments in modern American history?
Yes, I do. I think it was the first time in history that the United States had committed our entire nation to achieve a political and military combined mission in which we failed. And this was a sobering blow to our self-esteem and maybe a pretty severe blow to our worldwide esteem as judged by outsiders. And I think it sent a cautionary signal throughout the American society, including the members of Congress, and maybe presidents and the public, that we should be more cautious in military adventurism, particularly when we endangered our own stature. And one of the lessons that we learned then was if we should go to war, that we would have a maximum commitment of the international community, as many close allies and committed friends and supporters as possible. And I think this is what George Bush Sr. did in the first Gulf War. He made sure that we didn't go there until we had a broad range of support. These lessons that were learned, I think, have been forgotten or ignored in the present Iraq War. But I think the lessons are still there, and they might very well be proven to be efficacious or applicable because of developing circumstances that have occurred in Iraq during the last 3 years. That it was a mistake for us to go in effect, unilaterally, in a war that was not necessary, was no threat to our own national security, and pretty much based on false premises.
And Mr. President, finally, if there's a way to step back and view how the Carter White House was different, how it was affected by the fact that there had been a Vietnam War. I know it's almost impossible to look at it, how it would have been in the vacuum of the absence of a war, but how did it taint or affect your decision-making in foreign policy on an ongoing basis?
Well, I don't know how differently I would have looked on international affairs and the use of military force and so-called adventurism if Vietnam had not occurred. But I think I was part of a political reaction to Vietnam in that I felt that our nation should husband and enhance tremendously our military capability, that our first emphasis should be on diplomacy in resolving disputes, not just involving ourselves but others like in the Middle East, that we should reach out as much as possible to other major powers to become our allies. That's why I normalized relations with the People's Republic of China after 35 years of different policy. It was why I tried to resolve the problems in this hemisphere that were festering like a cancer based around the Panama Canal issue. Why I tried to evolve a new and acceptable and mutually beneficial treaty. So I think a lot of the things that I did as president were at least indirectly affected by the aftermath of the Vietnam War.
President Carter, on behalf of the Kennedy Library and all those watching and listening, thank you so much for taking the time to take our questions on this topic.
It's been a pleasure, Brian. Thank you, and my best wishes to all those at Kennedy Center.
The men taking the stage, the dais, familiar to all of you. I've been asked to state the obvious, and that is their bios are in your packets, should you need more on them as they get settled. Again, our thanks to President Carter. I must say, candidly, more revealing interview than I expected going in, his thoughts on the Vietnam War and its effects on him and his presidency. I think this is going to be difficult to balance. No shortage of issues today, though we do have finite periods of time for the panels gathered. And I think it's probably best to begin with an overarching question that I'll pose in different ways to our participants, and I guess it should be worded, what went wrong? And I suppose if there's a home field advantage in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to be had in this repository of artifacts from the Kennedy administration, it should go to Ted Sorensen. And so, Ted, I'll put the first question this way. Pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty. Did the United States become captive of either our own rhetoric or our own swagger at the time in Vietnam?
No.
This microphone here in front of you.
No. But let me say a few opening words, Brian, if I may, without taking too much time from our distinguished panelists. The fact that you begin with quoting President Kennedy's words and that we're in this wonderful repository of his words, it puts me in an awkward position because the audience will expect me to be as eloquent as he was, forgetting that he had a much better speechwriter than I do. In any event, much as I'm fond of the slogan, so to speak, of the National Archives, which was mentioned earlier, what's past is prologue, roughly translated, that means you ain't seen nothing yet. I think what should be emblazoned up on the wall behind this panel and kept in mind by everyone up here, but everyone on any panel today, including even the historians, something that President Truman was reported to have said, which is, and I keep this in mind often, the average high school sophomore in Independence, Missouri, equipped with hindsight, is smarter than the President of the United States. So, sure, with hindsight, it's easy to point out errors of commission and omission with respect to Vietnam by a string of presidents. But in one sense, the premise of this conference, and one word is wrong when it says in the brochure that the war in Vietnam was central to the presidencies of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and so on. Down the line. The truth of the matter is the war in Vietnam was not central to the foreign policy of President Kennedy. Berlin was central. Cuba was central. The Soviet Union One might even say United Nations, nuclear testing, a number of other issues. I even have with me a memorandum I wrote to President Kennedy at the end of, nearing the end of his first year in office in 1961, in which I am asking him whether the time is coming when he wants to go on national television and talk about Southeast Asia, because I said the other major issues facing this presidency, such as the ones I just mentioned, have all been the subject of a presidential address, but you've said nothing so far about Southeast Asia. The fact is, Vietnam was a low-level insurrection at that time. There was no pitched war with North Vietnam yet. The Viet Cong were a disorganized guerrilla group. They were conducting assassinations. I don't want to minimize its seriousness, but it never raised to the level of the other major crises confronting the Kennedy administration, and there were plenty of them.
Jack Valenti, here we are at the Kennedy Library, and yet the photo on the front of the brochure advertising this event, Vietnam and the Presidency, is of your boss, watching an armada of helicopters approach. Brings to mind the great story as President Johnson was being escorted out to his chopper. An military aide said, "Mr. President, I'll take you to your helicopter." He said, "Son, they're all my helicopters." And Jack, you and I have spent some time at the other library, as they call it, out in Austin. I've listened to all of the released phone conversation tapes that are extant from the library, the LBJ library thus far, and there are conversations embedded in those tapes to be heard where President Johnson is heard saying, in effect, this is the way Kennedy would have proceeded. The cynics say that's because of the two people on the phone, one of them knew it was being recorded for posterity. Your view on how and why Lyndon Johnson proceeded down the road he did from the day he took the presidency forward?
Well, first I'd like to say that to Caroline that I'm a devoted admirer of her mother. She bought, when she was at Doubleday, the only work of fiction I ever did, and she became my editor. And I must say I came to know her very well, and I came to love her very much, and I just wanted you to know that. I am one of those who was on the airplane with President Johnson when he took the oath of office on that awful nightmarish day in Dallas, when in a senseless act of mindless malice, which is a phrase coined by Mr. Sorensen, the 35th president was murdered in the streets of Dallas, and the new president summoned me to Air Force One, hired me that day, and I flew back with him as his newly hired special assistant. That night, the very night of his first night of his presidency, he lay in bed in his bedroom in Spring Valley. Bill Moyers and Cliff Carter were there until about 11 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. And we were all watching television as commentators all over the world inspected this new leader of the free world. And he talked about what he wanted to do to pass Kennedy's civil rights bill, which had been hung up, as he put it, too goddamn long in the Senate. He was going to get it out. Talked about having a voting rights bill and passing President Truman's medical insurance. But Vietnam was not mentioned on that first night. I have to say that what President Johnson wanted to do, and made it clear to me and others, he wanted to make sure that the legacy of John Kennedy and all the things that he sought to achieve were kept in place. 5 days after he was president, Ted Sorensen wrote a brilliant speech for him in which he rose before a joint session of the Congress and said, President Kennedy said, "Let us begin. I say, let us continue." Now, on the day that he had his hand upraised on that airplane, we had over 16,000 fighting men in Vietnam. They were disguised as advisors, but they were heavily armed and they were in the field. One of the unanswerable questions is, if there were no troops in Vietnam at that time, would Johnson have sent them? I don't know the answer. All I know is that he determined to keep in place every single advisor to President Kennedy and every member of Kennedy's cabinet, and he did. I happen to believe politically that was a mistake, but my opinions at that time weren't relevant. And I think it's fair to say, Ted can offer his judgment, every aide to President Kennedy, when they left under their own steam. He wanted to make sure that the country knew that he would not disrupt any policy that Kennedy had in place. Now, later on in this panel, I can tell you some of the things that we learned in Vietnam that I think Iraq, that comes out of Iraq, the sour odor of the same aromas that we found in Vietnam, and there's a lot to be learned from that. But I have to say that President Johnson determined, as I said, to hold on to Kennedy's legacy, whatever he thought that would be. And the idea of getting out of Vietnam at that time was alien to him, because that would look like a repudiation. And then we got deeper and deeper, and the Pentagon would come forward with, we can do this on the cheap, Mr. President. We can do this and that, interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, do a little bombing, and the North Vietnamese will come to the table. But if I may, we learned something in Vietnam. I happen to have fought 2 wars. One is a 21-year-old combat pilot whose greatest achievement in World War II after 51 missions was, I survived. Believe me, that's no inconsiderable achievement. And the second one, fighting a war in Vietnam, I learned 4 things. One, that no president can win a war when public support for that war begins to decline and to evaporate. It's like setting a heavy body loose down a hill, and once it goes, you lose control of it. There is a line that I read somewhere that says, the people grow tired of a confusion whose end is not in sight. That's the primary thing that I learned. You cannot fight a war without public support. And the second thing is, you cannot, no matter what mighty army you are, conquering a foreign land, you cannot win against an insurgency that springs from the population with their traditions and their religion and their culture. Never has been done in history. In Afghanistan, in Dien Bien Phu, the American colonies, and you name it. And there's never been an insurgency that didn't prevail against a mighty power. And the third thing I learned was that if you're going to fight an enemy, you got to know who they are. You got to know the ancestral rhythms and their traditions, their mores, their customs. I remember one time going into the president's office and saying, Mr. President, I'd like to have you invite Bernard Fall and other historians of Indochina to tell you, who are these people? What do we know about them? And he said, I think that's a good idea. Go see Bundy. And I went to see McGeorge Bundy, who said, listen, Jack, he said, do we have our own historians at the agency, the CIA, and state? And our historians know as much as anybody needs to know about that country. Well, as I left, I said to Mac, that may be so, Mac, but I haven't seen any of our historians briefing the president on who these people are. And the fourth thing I learned was that the Pentagon, about 60 to 70% of all their forecasts, and by the way, this is done through retrospective wisdom, as makes us all very smart. That 60 to 70% of all the estimates, the forecasts, the recommendations they made turned out to be wrong. Now, I'm not saying, believe me, there are 2 things. I never caustically criticize any president of any party, because I know what he has to go through. And I don't believe that the Pentagon, McNamara on down, were developing delusive juices to pass on to the president about body counts and what they were. I don't believe that at all. They just were wrong. I learned in Hollywood that nobody knows anything. And I learned that in the government, nobody knows anything. In Wall Street, nobody knows anything. The vagaries of error infect us all. And when you rely totally on the military, no matter how gifted they are, General Haig, you accept it, of course, they can be wrong. And there's a General Clausewitz, who was a Prussian strategist, who once said that in battle things happen he called friction. That the minute the battle begins, he defined friction as something that wasn't anticipated in the battle plan, and therefore friction multiplies. And he said friction is what distinguishes war from war games. And finally, we were operating under a delusion called the domino theory. Eisenhower believed it, Kennedy believed it, Johnson believed it. I don't know about Nixon and Ford. But it turned out to be a piece of defunct mythology, the idea that if Vietnam fell, all of Indochina would fall. Now, those are the four things I learned, and after that, I am absolutely vacant of any other great ideas.
Always good to have the vacant Jack Valenti with us. We have, in addition to past his prologue then, we have a few quotes to work with here, including "Nobody Knows Anything" and "Defunct Mythology." And Dr. Kissinger, that's where I'll start with you. In the rearview mirror of history, was the domino theory indeed defunct mythology?
One can't answer that question because there's a division of opinion on the subject. There are people who argue, who live in the area, that if Vietnam had collapsed at the beginning, when President Kennedy and President Johnson made the initial commitment, that then all of Southeast Asia would have also collapsed, that Indonesia, which was a closely run case in which there was a communist insurrection, which was narrowly defeated, would have disintegrated, and that this would have had the consequences that were predicted. After Vietnam collapsed, 10 years later, 12 years later, the situation in Indonesia had changed. The communist insurrection had been substantially defeated there, so that those particular consequences did not occur. I personally believe this was not I personally believe that when the United States commits itself with a number of forces that we did, there are consequences, and one cannot pretend that there are no consequences to the defeat of a country on which the security of so much of the free world depended at the time. But I'd like to make a comment about the earlier point. I believe that the presidents who first committed themselves in Vietnam and those who continued did so for noble motives. I believe that their judgment of the dangers that existed was essentially correct. There were a number of difficulties that arose. One was that they, in all administrations, from Truman through Nixon and Johnson, they all applied the containment theory that worked in Europe to Asia. And they did not sufficiently appreciate that Vietnam was not a nation as the European nations had been. Secondly, there was not an adequate understanding of the nature of guerrilla war, and there was not a willingness to face the consequences of the deployment of American forces. The traditional American strategy of attrition could not work against an enemy who did not have to fight because he had no territory to defend. And we wound up in the grotesque situation that there were North Vietnamese divisions in Cambodia. The whole supply system of North Vietnam went through Laos. Every year, 60,000 troops came through Laos and tens of thousands of supply. And we, in our public debate, argued that those were neutral countries where we could not not resist. Those were ground rules that couldn't work. Third, and I was part of this too, we had a misunderstanding of the nature of negotiations. How many times did President Johnson plaintively say, why don't the Vietnamese turn the key because they can unlock the door to peace? We did not understand that for the North Vietnamese, a compromise was the equivalent of a defeat. They had not fought for 20 years in order to make a compromise, and that one could not come to a negotiated solution unless there was a military outcome. We kept presenting to ourselves the war as a choice between diplomacy and warfare. And I must say, in my personal experience, it took me a while to fully grasp it. And finally, we have to face as a country the fact that we defeated ourselves. We weren't defeated by the Vietnamese. We defeated ourselves by the divisions. When I first started in these discussions at Harvard, and most of my friends, all of my friends, were really part of the Kennedy administration or sympathetic to when I first started, there was a debate what was doable, what was not doable. By the time I was in office, the debate had become about the moral quality of American leadership. And there was a almost Civil War type division between the contending forces in America, so that the difficult, painful choices that had to be made were made in a context that did not permit a real debate, and everybody had some contribution to make to that. And finally, we have to say to ourselves, when we keep talking about defeat in Vietnam, when you cut military assistance from 2.4 billion to 700 million, when you prohibit military action in the face of the most blatant violations, you are bound to lose. That is so. What we need to learn from Vietnam, and one reason I'm here, is to see what we can learn in terms of having a more unified public discussion and an ability to look at these issues from the point of view that serious people on all sides had a difficult problem, and at the end, they didn't manage to come together.
Secretary Haig, wearing your hat as General Haig and noting that Valenti has fired the first volley at the military intelligence here today, looking back, how was the information various presidents were receiving from the military, now thoroughly documented, how was it so wrong, noting that they always say the invisible member of Congress, the cabinet, and presidential advisors is our old dear Washington friend, Rosie Scenario?
Usually wrong, but I think what the misnomer here is that this was the military's decision. Most of our intelligence apparatchik is civilian. The CIA and all the other top agencies, and that started in the Korean War, which hasn't come up in this event, but it all confirms, as did yesterday's discussion, that no party in the United States has a monopoly on incompetent crisis management or conflict management. None of them. I've served them all. I'm the one fellow here that was here on the takeoff and the landing. I worked for Bob McNamara as Deputy Special Assistant when we got into the war. I worked for Jimmy Carter when he overthrew the Shah of Iran, the consequences of which we're still paying for. I worked for Richard Nixon, of course, and Jerry Ford, and they weren't without their mistakes. But I think that's the first thing that would line up behind Henry, and it's time we defractionalized this thing and got a little more realistic. Now, yesterday we had a debate. How many were in the room yesterday with all our presentations? Quite a few, but I left there a little bit concerned. First, because there was a constant discussion about this being a nationalist conflict, which we never understood in Vietnam. And we translated it as a Marxist-Leninist ideological struggle. Well, the simple facts are that none of the presidents for whom I worked ever was able to detach the Cold War, the U.S.-Soviet relationship, from the struggle in Vietnam. So whatever the historians may say about nationalism versus ideological Marxism, it's irrelevant. It's true, but it's irrelevant because the war was dominated by East-West relations and the superpower confrontation. Believe me. That's point one, so let's dispense with that. Secondly, we had a perversion of strategic thinking. And there, unfortunately, I'm in the hospitality of the Kennedy Library, but I have to say it began with the Kennedy administration. And that was the spectrum of conflict, you'll recall it. We had nuclear warfare, we had conventional warfare, and then we had guerrilla warfare and insurgencies. And we somehow had to learn to deal with all three. And it created a new school of McNamaraism, where whiz kids were brought in from our faculties here at Harvard, Yale, other places. And I sat there and watched them come in, and I watched their thinking start to impose itself on the entire Pentagon. And it resulted in what I call incrementalism in the conduct of conflict. And the theory was, and I think we just had Dr. Schelling at Harvard to get some kind of an award for his wisdom. But he's the fellow that brought to the conflict spectrum the belief that the best way to control the escalation of conflict was to match it, step by step. In other words, and it started in the Berlin contingency planning, which we used to call the poodle blanket, and I worked on it, and I was repelled by the thinking. It went something like this. If the Russians block Berlin by a platoon of forces, you will be best served by responding with a platoon of forces. So you keep it at a low level of intensity. And that will bring you conflict management, the outcome of which will be non-conflict. My judgment is precisely the opposite. In reality, if one reads history. A conflict, if you enter into it, God forbid, must be entered into with the full knowledge that your nation is being committed to the sacrifice of its young men and women. And for that reason, every asset of the nation must be applied to the struggle to bring about a quick and prompt, successful end, or don't do it. That is the second perversion, incrementalism, that has reared its ugly head again in Iraq. How can we believe that this kind of, we send 2 1/3 divisions into Iraq when George Bush Sr. had 26 division equivalents? And he didn't get rid of Saddam Hussein. That was a conscious decision of grave consequences and a big mistake. And so we're there trying to police that up today, aren't we? Now, that is another thing. Now, my friend Jack, who I admire so immensely because we're Hollywood guys. I've been on MGM board, and I love it. And it was just a great thing. We made a lot of money selling it to our Japanese friends.
Speak for yourself.
Now, having said that, somebody said there's no domino theory. What in heaven's name? Where have you been? There was a domino theory. And you know who saved us from it? And that is another dimension of the conflict that was totally ignored yesterday, and that's the role of the People's Republic of China and the consequences of splitting China from the Soviet Union for global achievement. Now, how do I know there was a global domino theory? I knew it because when I was in NATO, I got a call from the Chinese ambassador. He said, I want to talk to you. He came over. He said, we are going to have to punish Hanoi because they're in the process of overrunning Thailand, Cambodia. They will surely turn to Burma. And this is going to be done at the sufferance of the Soviet Union. Now, they had to go in. They cost them 50,000 dead Chinese because they learned some bitter combat lessons. They hadn't been in war for many years. And as a result, they lost a lot of people, but they did punish Hanoi, and that domino theory collapsed. So we owe the People's Republic of China a great deal of credit for preventing the domino theory. I tell you that. And don't think there wasn't one. There was one, of course. Now, having said that, let me suggest that we underline what Henry just raised, too, and that was Vietnam. We didn't lose Vietnam. We quit Vietnam. We strangled our effort. When the final hours of the bombing at Christmas time took place, and Henry and I know a lot about that, we were very much in favor of it, and it brought Hanoi to its knees. It also occurred at a time when the Soviet Union's unraveling was very evident. It was beginning a process of advanced decay. When I hear my Republican friends, my Reaganauts, say that Ronald Reagan single-handedly won the Cold War, I say hogwash. The Cold War was won by every American president of both parties throughout the spectrum of that conflict, joined by our European friends and many other allies around the world. We did it incompetently and incompetently, but it was the deciding factor. Now, what brought the Soviet Union to its knees? A flawed political system which inevitably was doomed from the day it was installed. And that's what leaders should be telling the American people. Not that some smart politician was able to defeat it when nobody else was. I used to give speeches in NATO Europe in the 70s. And I can remember first to the North Atlantic Council, I said, the Soviet Union is in an advanced state of decay. And if we just stay together and stay united and stay strong, we are going to witness its demise in our lifetime. And I think Ronald Reagan played a big role as a catalyst in that inevitable historic process. But there's my little contribution. And I hope we get down to the realities of what we're discussing here today, because we're in the midst of another struggle where it appears to me we haven't learned very much. Thank you.
Secretary Haig, thank you. Well, then, we're officially underway. And back to you, Ted Sorensen. Present as you were at the creation. We've now just heard the expression "whiz kids" thrown around as a pejorative. That combination of intellectual candle power and post World War II military firepower, the campaign, obviously. Eisenhower v. Kennedy was about the missile gap. I used the word swagger in my first question to you. How much do you think that there was a sense of drunkenness combined with a misunderstanding, naivete, having to do with what Jack Valenti talked about as the ancestral rhythms, and what we later learned was the unending military strength of the Vietnamese forces that led the United States into the fix it got in?
You're asking me to comment on Jack's ancestral rhythms?
Well, good Lord, we'll be here all day.
I would say you've got the wrong administration when you talk about a sense of drunkenness. I think that sense of headiness, I have always thought, since the Bay of Pigs, that the first 100 days in any administration is the most dangerous time, because there is a sense of headiness. The new president has just taken office. He's won the election against all the predictions to the contrary. He's taken over the most powerful position in the free world. There's a big iron fence around the White House that keeps out anybody that wants to object or protest or tell you otherwise. You're surrounded by people who say, yes, Mr. President, you're absolutely right, Mr. President. It's a dangerous time. A new president thinks he has a magic touch and can do no wrong. Kennedy discovered at the Bay of Pigs that was absolutely untrue. But Vietnam did not rise during that period. Laos was more of a concern. In Eisenhower's last briefing to Kennedy, he warned him that he would probably have to send combat troops to Laos. And Kennedy never did. He tried to neutralize Laos, which I'm sure some of the people at this table think was a mistake, because the North Vietnamese were using the trails through Laos to send men and material to South Vietnam. But Vietnam itself, as I mentioned, was not a major issue for Kennedy. Eisenhower had begun the policy of sending in military advisors and instructors. Jack or someone here said that was merely a disguise. They were actually combat troops. That may well be. I don't know that as a fact. But Kennedy reinforced the policy of sending in advisors and instructors. 3 different missions were sent to Vietnam. One was headed by Vice President Johnson, another one by Chief of Military Joint Chiefs Staff, Max Taylor, a wonderful general. Another by first he was Deputy National Security Advisor, later Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, Walt Rostow. All 3 of those missions came back and said essentially the same thing. Mr. President, you have to send combat troop divisions to South Vietnam. It's the only way to save South Vietnam. And you have to bomb North Vietnam. That's the other essential. And Kennedy listened to all 3 reports, but never once did he send combat troop divisions to South Vietnam or bomb North Vietnam. He was the best speech Kennedy ever made on Vietnam, interestingly enough, he made in 1954 when he warned Eisenhower and the American people from the Senate floor that we could not replace the French colonialists in Vietnam. As Al Haig said, it was a war, a nationalist war, and they were sick of having foreign troops on their soil, and no Western power, the United States or the French, was going to win such a battle. And young Senator John Kennedy said it would be futile, hopeless for us to send combat troop divisions there, and he never did.
Jack, after Secretary Haig mentioned that his quote about every asset of a nation has to be put into the effort quickly, promptly for resolution of the war, or don't do it. Back to those tapes again. Two notable things from Lyndon Johnson's late-night phone conversations. He says to Dick Russell, I don't know whether to get all the way in, and I can't get all the way out. The Situation Room calling at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. Mr. President, we had 4 aircraft out tonight. 3 of them returned. He was notorious for spending sleepless nights in the sit room, really guiding individual sorties and missions. The micromanagement of the war, why his kind of jumping in with one foot, limited fighting of the war that John McCain has complained about the target list he was given as a pilot, that the targets to avoid outnumbered the targets to hit.
One thing we have to understand is that hindsight is such a spectacular asset because we see everything in all its full, glorious reality. The fact is that every president has to deal in real time. What order do I give at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning? I remember when Walter Lippmann and Scotty Reston would come in fulminating about the war, that President Johnson would give them a yellow pad and a lead pencil. He says, okay, write down for me, Walter, what is the order I give at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning? And of course, all of a sudden it's misty kind of philosophical answers, but nobody could write it down. The fact is that you have to deal in real time. Johnson's greatest fear, which I heard him utter to me privately dozens of times, he felt that he might start World War III. He used to say that, some aviator is going to drop a bomb down a smokestack of a Russian freighter in Haiphong Harbor, and the pilot will be from Johnson City, Texas, and we got World War III going on. He had a terrible horror of that. Now, you can talk about military adventures, but when you're president, the specter of another war like that is quite terrifying. So whenever I hear people talk about, and I say this, I happen to have a great devotion and admiration for Henry because I think he's one of the great political philosophers of our time, and I certainly admire Al Haig immensely. But I differ with them on the idea that you go all out, because going all out has consequences. You will incite people like a China. Remember MacArthur crossing the Yalu, and suddenly China comes in, and we have the goddamnedest mess you ever saw, a bloody mess in Korea. Clausewitz was right. Friction comes in. Things you never anticipated happen. Johnson did personally say, I don't want to get too close to Hanoi. And he used to examine the SAM sites to make sure that we didn't go too close to Hanoi. It was a limited incursion, no question about that. But the obverse side of that is going all out. What new gargoyles do you incite? And second, trying to impress upon nations that have no democratic history a democratic government is damn hard to do. I remember that President Diem was assassinated in October of '63, and after that, Vietnam had a succession, a kind of a revolving door of new governments, one coup after another. I remember, Ted, I went in to see him one morning. I said, I just heard from the State Department, Mr. President, there's another coup in Vietnam. And Johnson just came agitating. He said, God damn it, I'm sick and tired of this coup shit that keeps coming back all the time. You couldn't install a government. Now we're engaged in Iraq now. We're trying to impress upon a people without democratic traditions a democratic institution. This democracy gets very messy. And suddenly you got people in power, democratically elected, like Hamas in Palestine, that we don't like, we don't want, but that's the democratic process. Sometimes in this country we elect people that half the country doesn't like. But that's the process of democracy. So I'm saying to you, I think America ought to stay out of alien adventures in foreign places unless our security is directly affected, because you set in motion a train of events that once that you let that body down a hill, as I said earlier, you lose control over it. So all I'm saying to you is that I saw President Johnson agonize on this. Bill Moyers and I were in his bedroom every morning at 7 o'clock, 12 hours difference. He's on the phone with McNamara about Vietnam, 12 hours difference, finding out the casualties. And I remembered one morning I said, Mr. President, you know, that's pretty tough, isn't it? He said, let me tell you something, Jack. Sending young men out to die is like drinking carbolic acid every morning. It is not pleasant. So, having lived through that, as I said, I understand what President Bush is going through. I may not agree with everything, but I know what he's dealing with now. And it's a terrible agony for a president. Therefore, the answer is, don't commit your troops and your young men. And by the way, it's always young men who go to war and die. The older bastards don't do that. They stay back and say, well, I know you're doing a good job out there, and so forth. Don't commit unless our national security is directly affected.
Interesting, the man who gave Hollywood its rating system has given C-SPAN an R-rated... Those of you kids watching at home, ask your folks to explain some of the vocabulary you'll hear here today. Dr. Kissinger, the part of our, as I made clear at the start, part of our forum here today is audience questions. It'll come as a surprise to no one that the cards are already coming in. This next question is asked of all four of you, but it's your turn. Is there anything you would like to apologize for?
This is not the occasion for this sort of a question. So if I can comment on what was said before, you have to start from the assumption that serious people were making serious decisions with the national interest and the world interest at heart. And so this is the sort of question that's highly inappropriate. Now, I'd like to make a comment on what Jack said. There was a Cold War. It's in defense of the original decisions. There was a Cold War going on. There had been a Berlin ultimatum in 1957. There was a Berlin ultimatum in 1961. There was a 50 megaton bomb exploded in September 1961. There had been nuclear missiles sent to Cuba. So therefore, to think that events in the world were connected was not an irrational decision. It was a very rational decision. Now, the friends I had in the Kennedy administration were explaining to me, and I think they had a good point, that guerrilla war was a new form of warfare which was being added to nuclear war and conventional war, that the previous administrations had managed to stop nuclear war and conventional war, and that it was the task of the Kennedy administration to stop guerrilla war. It was an absolutely rational decision. And the sending of advisors, considering that President Eisenhower had recommended to President Kennedy to send combat troops to Laos as the first step in the administration, was also a very understandable and rational decision. The next question then is about going all out. You have the choice about sending 500,000 troops or not sending 500,000 troops. But you don't have the choice between winning and losing once you've sent 500,000 troops. And then when you have sent 500,000 troops, how to extricate yourself becomes a problem that you cannot deal with by the gradualist assessment of what you do every day, which runs the risk of having the other side match it every day, and you then go up into an endless war. The Nixon administration didn't send the 500,000 troops. It found the 500,000 troops. And how you extricate when you are the country on which the security of the world depends. First, how you extricate 500,000 troops technically the amount of time it takes when you are surrounded by 1 million North Vietnamese and 1 million South Vietnamese who could turn on you if you suddenly pulled the plug. This is a very complex, this is a question that could not be dealt with by slogans and by advocating peace. And all the decisions that we have made had to be seen in that context. Were mistakes sometimes made? That's open to a lot of debate. But that sort of question, that sort of implies that there's some horrible guilt that people ought to be avowing when they face the situation of 500,000 Americans. In fact, withdrew those 500,000 Americans. And without the catastrophe that could have happened, that's not an appropriate question. And it has nothing to do with my own personal feelings. It has to do with how, as a country, we look at ourselves. That serious people make serious decisions ought to be taken for granted. And then we can have a meaningful debate and can come to answers that guide us. That way is a way of dividing us, torturing ourselves, and making it easy for ourselves. Because there's no reason to suppose that the people who ask that sort of question have a more elevated moral standing than people who every day had to face the sort of decision that Jack Valenti faced. And when you know that if it comes out wrong, the fate of your country and of free peoples depends on it.
Respectfully,
Let me add something here now, Jack.
Just one moment. Respectfully, Dr. Kissinger, I'm seeing this theme running through a lot of these questions coming up here, and as the advocate for the questioners and the audiences, quote, you policymakers ripped the heart and soul from 58,245 American families. What do you say to those families and the sacrifices they made because of your lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of caring? It's been 30 years. There's a whole lot of anger about the conflict, Dr. Kissinger. That's what the question was meant to...
But anger isn't enough. You owe it to yourself to analyze what the implications are and what the real choices were.
Let me add something here. Everybody likes to personalize this, and this whole debate has gotten between presidential advocates. And that's not the issue at all. The issue is what we learn from the bloody lessons of history. It was Winston Churchill who was asked once, how do you become a statesman? And he replied, read history, young man, read history. Now, the history of the Cold War, there are some conclusions to be drawn from it because we may be entering another global conflict with radical Islam. And that's why these meetings are so significant, so important, and so important that we strip out what I call the partisanship and get down to the historic realities. One of those historic realities, Jack, is the overestimation of the Soviet Union throughout the span of the Cold War. As I look back I started out working for Douglas MacArthur, and I received the first call from Museo in Seoul announcing the North was coming south. And we automatically overestimated right then and there the Soviet Union. It dominated everything. The Cold War is a prime example of that. And that's why I said, I wrote a memo to Joe Califano in 1965 when I was working for Bob McNamara. And I said, the way we are starting to get involved in Vietnam is a sure path to defeat. And I was talking about incrementalism. And Joe brought that down to me recently when he was writing his I guess you'd call it a memoir. And he said, Al, how did you know? And I said, because we went into the war in a tentative way, thinking we could have guns and butter at the same time. You remember that debate, Jack, during the Johnson years and the Kennedy years. And my point is this, and that's why I was so strongly behind the statement made by our guest speaker last night, Halberstrom, who said we never should have junked the draft. I think the dismissal of the draft as a system where our young people grow up feeling some obligation to serve their country one way or the other, in uniform or out, was not only an important social aspect of our society, it was the core of our patriotism. Who in the Congress of the United States would have put up with 10 years of insanity in Vietnam if their young people had been on the firing line and bleeding and dying like the youngsters from our inner cities and our farms, whose parents had no influence? And that's why I said to President Nixon, when he called me and they said, I hear you're trying to sabotage my study on doing away with the draft. And I said, that's right, because you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Get a draft that's fair and honest and ecumenical in every sense of the word, and that every youngster serves, not just the non-influential young kids in America.
Ted Sorensen.
May I just say something?
Go ahead, Jack.
I wish that you had sent that memo to Bob McNamara. President Johnson used to say, a president's judgment is no better than his information. I promise you, Al, as I sat into every single meeting from November 22nd for 3 years that the president sat in on Vietnam. I took copious notes, which are at the LBJ library, of what everybody said at the time, so they can't deny what they were saying. The fact is, the Pentagon was the one who kept saying, we can win the war on the cheap, Mr. President. A little bombing here, we can interdict these guys carrying a bandolier of of ammunition, a rifle, and a bag of rice coming down Ho Chi Minh Trail. We can do this, and they then will come to the table. They didn't realize what Henry said. They weren't about to come to the table. But the president was relying on the forecasts, the estimates, the recommendations of what came from the Pentagon, who was supposed to be the custodians of all truth that happened in Vietnam. So that memorandum, which was quite accurate, should have been directed to McNamara and John Naughton and McNaughton and all these people. So when he came to the president, he said, Mr. President, let me tell you what Al Haig said, and I agree with him.